welcome you all here to hear a wonderful presentation. It's our second in this season. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February, you know, it was pretty alarming. I was watching the news daily here and in the Finnish news as well. Knowing the history and having my dad serve in the army, you know, it was hard to think about what might happen. So today we're going to hear insights of what happened really after the tensions increased and we needed to do something. So we have today's speaker, Veikko Valli, here, who is our Honorary Consul for Finland in Portland. Veikko Valli was born and raised in Finland. Turns out we were born in the same city, Pori. And he after high school, attended the Swedish-speaking School of Economics, Hanken, in Helsinki. So he's got his master's degree in economics. So after graduating, he drifted into the financing world, investments, and he worked in different financial institutions in Helsinki, San Francisco, London, before settling into the Portland area in 2015. He is the co-founder and the chief investment officer at this company called Snowstorm Capital. And now I have to read his job, or he's focused on trading strategies, forecasting unexpected surprises in European equities. That's pretty topic right now. Not easy. So since becoming the Honorary Consul, he's attended meetings in Helsinki and here regarding and been briefed with the political people in Finland about the current situation. So he's been doing a lot of research and following the news. And I'm happy to invite you, Veikko, up here to do your presentation. We will have a question and answer session for the live audience here after the presentation. And also we'll have refreshments so we can all discuss and debrief together afterwards. So welcome and thank you.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And thanks for showing us up here in such large numbers. I know it's a commitment to spend your Friday night listening to a lecture about geopolitics, history, and new direction in the Nordic region. So Veikko Valli is my name. I'm the Honorary Consul of Finland in Oregon. And I'm giving a speech about the Nordics and NATO, and especially some of the key decisions that took place after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Both Finland and Sweden have decided to apply for NATO membership as a result, and I will talk about some of the security issues in the Nordics and look in detail into the process that pushed Finland and Sweden towards NATO. Even if many of us have the attack on Ukraine foremost on our mind, this talk is not focused on the situation in Ukraine. It's good, however, to note that both Finland and Sweden have strongly condemned Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. They've provided material, military, and humanitarian support to Ukraine, often in quite unprecedented ways compared to what they've done before. My role as Honorary Consul does not traditionally have a foreign policy aspect to it. Don't thus expect my speech to be a verbatim rendering of my government's policies, but more of an update by a knowledgeable observer. I will also simplify issues a little bit. If you require nuance, I suggest that you look at official sources and academic interpretations. I think it's good also to note that it's a speech about quite a serious topic. And we are aware of most of the discussion that has been published in the media, but there is obviously going to be a degree of discussion that has taken behind closed doors, and we are necessarily not knowledgeable about those discussions. I think and I hope you will find this deep dive into the geopolitical situation in Europe interesting. And before I begin, thanks to Nordic Northwest for asking me to speak today. So what is the Nordics? Well, the Nordics is the world's happiest region. 28 million happy, skilled and innovative people live in well-educated and modern economies. On the slide, we have a kaleidoscope of scenes from the Nordic region. We have the flags, wind turbines, some Norwegian fjords, the Queen's horse carriage, an example of public transportation in Helsinki, a Swedish cityscape, some summer cottages, and an example of some of the high-quality education in the region. The Nordic countries share not only their location in North Europe, but also similar cultures and political systems. All of them are small parliamentary democracies, highly egalitarian, have well-developed welfare systems, high gross national product per capita, high standards of living. They also, even though they are highly secularized, they share a common religious tradition in Lutheranism, which has maybe given the region some of its work ethic, and also is present in some of the symbols like the national flags. All of this could be called Nordic exceptionalism. And this has really served as a strategic resource for the whole region and acts as some kind of Nordic branding. Nordic exceptionalism was also important in the case of branding the Nordics as representing a so-called third way within the communist East and the capitalist West during the Cold War. So this speech will mainly be an educational speech or a viewpoint into recent history. I happen to be the Honorary Consul for Finland in Oregon, but it doesn't mean that I'm giving you, a government-issued set of slides. I'm talking here as my own independent person. Many are unfamiliar with the role. So what is an Honorary Consul? In my case, it means being the representative of the Finnish government in Oregon. Some of the responsibilities of my position include assisting citizens. This could include burial work or, in the worst case, repatriating bodies back to Finland. It could include country image work, and it also includes export and trade promotion. What Honorary Consuls do for Finland is they augment Finland's network of diplomatic missions. Finland has an embassy in Washington, D.C., headed by an ambassador. There are also consulate generals in Los Angeles and New York, headed by consul generals and both diplomatic and consular staff. But with large countries such as the United States, it's not very practical to have offices in every state. This, however, means that the distances that the citizens need to travel for their services become extremely long in some cases. And hence, it makes sense to have some local representation. And many countries find it economically feasible to utilize honorary consuls to extend their reach. The Vienna Convention of 1963 distinguishes between career consuls and honorary consuls and defines their legal status differently. Career consuls are civil servants of the sending country, whereas honorary consuls work on a voluntary basis, and they can be either, in the case of the US, they can be US citizens or Finnish citizens or citizens even of a third country, if that is the case. I already mentioned that my role doesn't traditionally have a foreign policy aspect to it. But one thing that my role has allowed has been to meet some of the highest decision makers in Finland earlier this year. The slide shows some of the meetings. We met with President Sauli Niinistö, with Speaker of the House Matti Vanhanen, and with Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto. And I'll mention at this stage that none of these politicians are social democrats. And I only mention this because later on in the speech I will talk a lot about social democratic politicians. So just making that slight remark here. What I took home from my meetings with the political decision makers was much sense of relief. These meetings took place in June, and this was after maybe the worst of the crisis, and after both Finland and Sweden had decided to apply for NATO. And so I had a sense of relief, particularly that Finland had internally reached consensus on some quite important decisions regarding its own national security when they decided to apply for NATO. Possibly even more insightful than the meetings with the political decision makers were chances to discuss with some key civil servants from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, and to hear briefings from generals with a background in military intelligence. So let's dive into the actual topic area. This slide showcases the Nordics and some of the key alliances. This map is a schematic, so Iceland has been brought a little bit closer to the mainland Nordics than it actually is in real life. So we have some of the key countries here: Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland. There are some other areas that also belong to the Nordic Council, and these include the Greenland Island, the Faroe Islands, and the Åland Islands. On the map, on the left, there's the flag of the European Union, and the EU is an economic and political alliance with Denmark, Finland, and Sweden as members. And on the right-hand side, we have the flag of NATO, so the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, and NATO is a military defensive alliance with Denmark, Norway, and Iceland as some of the founding members there. It's maybe good to note as well that some of the Nordic countries are monarchies: Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland and Iceland are republics. I said at the beginning that I would simplify issues a bit, and I will start doing that with a little look into some of the relevant history. So throughout their history, the Nordic countries have fought quite a few wars, many of them against each other and many of them against Russia. In between themselves, maybe it's been like brothers and sisters fighting in a family before they grow up and become sensible citizens. 200 years ago, Sweden themselves with Napoleon in a war against Russia and was militarily defeated. Finland, that had been part of Sweden for 600 years, was lost to Russia in this war, and Finland remained part of Imperial Russia for 100 years. Fast forward, before the Second World War, the Nordic countries were all independent, apart from Iceland, that was still part of Denmark. At the beginning of the Second World War, all the Nordic countries declared themselves neutral. However, Denmark was invaded by Nazi Germany. Iceland at the time became independent as a result. Iceland was invaded by the UK, without fighting, however, and had later American troops stationed on the island. Norway was invaded by Nazi Germany as well. Sweden managed to avoid war and remained neutral. Finland, who declared itself neutral as well, was attacked unprovoked by the Soviet Union, but was never invaded thanks to a tough defense during the Winter War. Once the war was over, Finland remained independent, but with heavy involvement of the Soviet Union in our affairs. Norway and Denmark had to wait a while for Soviet troops to leave some of the areas, Finnmark and Bornholm. All in all, with the exception of Sweden, neutrality did not really work that well for the Nordic region. So moving on from the Second World War into the Cold War, this showcases a map of Europe, and with NATO members in blue, it excludes some of the key members such as US and Canada, which are obviously also NATO members, just not shown on the map. The map shows Sweden and Finland in yellow. It shows the over 800-mile long border that Finland shares with Russia. In 1948, after the war, there was an attempt by Sweden to form a Scandinavian defense alliance. Finland would probably not had any chances in participating in this thanks to heavy Soviet Union influence on our affairs. This attempt did not work out. In the same year, something that shocked people in the Nordics and elsewhere was a situation in Czechoslovakia where a Soviet-backed coup took over the entire country and caused quite a lot of concern. The next year, in 1949, the NATO organization was founded on two premises. Firstly, to deter Soviet expansion and to deter a revival of European militarism. And at that time, Iceland, Norway and Denmark were with some of the first 12 founding members. I think the thinking in Norway and Denmark at the time was that a Scandinavian defense alliance would not have been enough to deter the Soviet Union and to secure their security. I'll fast forward a little bit in history. In 1955, West Germany joins NATO, and in response, the Soviet Union and 7 countries in Eastern Europe form a 8-nation Warsaw Pact, say a military defense union to counteract NATO. In 91, the Soviet Union collapses and the Warsaw Pact is dissolved. Some people consider this the end of the Cold War. In 94, Finland and Sweden become NATO's Partnership for Peace program members. And the following year, both countries joined the European Union. And at this time, Finland and Sweden give up their neutrality, joining a political and economical union like the European Union, but still remain militarily non-aligned. In 2001, there is a terrorist attack on the US, 9/11, and for the first time in NATO's history, they invoke something called the Article 5 treaty. And this Article 5 stipulates that an attack on any NATO member is an attack on all. And this is quite important to cover because when Finland and Sweden are looking to join a military defense alliance like NATO, an article like this that deters any aggression on them could be seen as one of the important cornerstones of seeking membership. Not the only reason, but one key issue. So NATO expansion has taken roughly 8 phases so far. In 2004, which is the last one I'll mention, they had the biggest expansion to date as 7 big countries became members, and at this time Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania also joined the alliance. Tensions really started building in Europe after 2007. A dawning was Putin's speech at a security conference in Munich, where he argued for a return to Russian greatness and rejected the existing European security architecture, with very critical views against the US and NATO expansion. The speech was followed by Russian attacks on Georgia in 2008 and the taking of Ukrainian Crimea in 2014. Looking at even more recent history, last December, Putin demanded security guarantees from the US and NATO, specifically stopping further NATO enlargement and deployment of weapon systems close to Russia, among other demands. These demands were actually quite serious. Firstly, this was already a tense time with the troop buildup outside of Ukraine. And secondly, these were clearly very strict demands that would have meant a fundamental change in how European security was set up and would essentially have meant a NATO withdrawal from parts of Eastern Europe. As a response, thinking about national security positioning in Finland started shifting. President Sauli Niinistö has reportedly realized early December that our long-held positioning was no longer well suited to the changing situation. The key issue here was that by demanding security guarantees and a stop to NATO enlargement, this would have prevented or limited Finland and Sweden from making decisions about their own future, including military non-alignment. With an understanding from the post-war period of belonging to Russia's sphere of influence, this did not sound very appealing in Finland, neither did it sound good in Sweden. Finnish and Swedish decision makers had also taken note of warnings that were issued by Russian Foreign Minister spokeswoman Maria Zakharova at Christmas. She warned Finland and Sweden of serious military and political retaliation if they joined NATO. These warnings were later toned down, But focusing on the initial warning given on 26th of December, these sounded quite serious. Maria Zakharova, the ministry's spokesperson, said, "It's quite obvious that Finland and Sweden joining NATO would have serious military and political consequences that would require an adequate response from the Russian side." In response to this, in an interview, Finland's foreign minister Pekka Haavisto pretty much said, "We've heard this before. We don't think that it calls for military threat. Should Finland be NATO's external border, it rather means that Russia would certainly take that into account in its own defense planning." Quite serious, however. It must have been tense moments deciding on how to react to the changing situation. 4 days after the warnings, President Niinistö had following quote in his New Year speech that well summarized the Finnish response. "Finland's room to maneuver and freedom of choice also include the possibility of military alignment and of applying for NATO membership should we ourselves so decide." Importantly, also our Prime Minister Sanna Marin, a social democrat here on the top right of the slide, echoed a similar message at the time. And this was important because her party was not yet ready to support Finland applying for membership in NATO, but I think it was important to have this unified response. Sweden's Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson, here on the bottom right of the slide, said at the time, "In Sweden, it is we ourselves who get to decide over our foreign and security policy and who we choose to cooperate with." Ukraine was attacked on 24th of February. It was a wake-up call in Finland and also Sweden, and 3 things became apparent. Firstly, a realization that the Russians are prepared to use large-scale military aggression to further their agenda. Secondly, the shared memory of the Soviet Union's attack on Finland in 1939 led the Finns to realizing that it could happen to us. Thirdly, as the assurances Budapest Treaty, where Ukraine was guaranteed sovereignty for giving up nuclear weapons at the time, as this treaty did not a realization that only membership in NATO would mean mutual defense guarantees and protection under Article 5. March of 2022 still had some worries and fears of escalation. I think it would have been a very different situation had the Russian attack on Ukraine proceeded in a better way than it did. But thanks to putting up a stronger than expected defense, the Ukrainians paved the way for some of the decisions that took place later on. At this time, opinion polls in Finland shifted in favor of NATO, and our political leaders saw a chance to abandon our status as a non-military aligned nation and to seek membership. It was not a hasty decision, and position papers and a parliamentary discussion followed, however, without delay. Focus at this time started shifting towards getting Sweden along. There were fears that a NATO decision could lead to an escalation of the war and concerns about security during the application process, the so-called gray zone. And this gray zone was important because while applying for membership, Finland and Sweden would obviously not yet be members, and hence this was seen as quite a vulnerable period. Intense dialogue between Finland and Sweden happened after the attack on Ukraine. At this time, Finland and Sweden had governments formed by Social Democrats holding the Prime Minister's office. And I feel it's important to cover this topic as both parties had also traditionally opposed NATO membership. A change of mind was required here to have a change in defense strategy. Swedish Social Democrats looked at what Finland do. It seems, based on commentary, that they did not think Finland would initially decide to join NATO. Maybe this was a generational issue. The old guard that had the connections across the Baltic Sea was against NATO. The new guard in power was willing to change direction, but had possibly failed to build connections between the younger Finnish and Swedish Social Democrats. And this made it difficult for Sweden to realize that Finland was indeed serious about NATO. In this case, Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin was clearly a decision maker. She had reportedly changed her mind regarding NATO membership already during her time as Prime Minister. And I think she was quite important in turning the Finnish Social Democrats in favor of membership. An example of the old guard still trying to seek other solutions other than NATO was an attempt by previous Finnish Foreign Minister Erkki Tuomioja trying to raise interest towards a Finnish-Swedish defense union. It was too late for this, however, and the message back from Sweden was that there is no mandate for such a path. Looking more closely at Sweden, in March, Mr. Andersson still said that Sweden's bid for NATO membership would destabilize the situation in the Baltic Sea. After a meeting with Finland's Prime Minister Sanna Marin in mid-April, Andersson, however, indicated that Sweden might indeed apply for it if Finland does so too. Once the Swedish Social Democrats realized that Finland was indeed NATO, they had to intensify their own internal deliberations. In addition to a tradition of consensus seeking and of 200 years of neutrality, they had to get their own long-time defense minister on board. And that is Peter Hultqvist on the right-hand side of the slide. Peter Hultqvist had been defense minister since 2014, and he had been instrumental in building the prevailing Swedish defense policy and was very much against NATO membership. There was even a doctrine named after him, the Hultqvist Doctrine, which was pretty much the prevailing Swedish defense doctrine. And in an interview after the decisions were made, he explained why Sweden had to walk away from this doctrine. And he said, firstly, a key to the doctrine was bilateral defense cooperation and increased defense investments. When a key partner, Finland, decided to go for NATO, it changed the picture. In May, finally, Sweden came along. When the Swedish Social Democrats made their decision on 15th of May, the argument for NATO was essentially this. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, it looked more difficult for Finland and Sweden to hold on to their strategy of keeping peace and stability in their region. As Finland decided for NATO, it would have left Sweden without its key security partner at a time when security and defense commitment should be increased. And at this time, focus shifted to security during the application process. The United Kingdom was the first to offer written security assurances to Finland and Sweden for the application process period. The US, Germany and France later also pledged military support during any possible NATO accession period, and also Norway, Iceland and Denmark provided support. At the press conference between the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Sauli Niinistö, there was an interesting quote. Asked the question, President Niinistö pretty much had a message for Russia that said, "You caused this, look at the mirror." The security assurances might have been important in removing some of the last obstacles in Finland and Sweden for filing applications for NATO membership. Both countries sent in their applications in May 2022 with hopes of being accepted as applicants at the July NATO summit in Madrid. An obstacle appeared, however, as Turkish President Erdogan proclaimed that his country was not in favor of the Nordic countries joining NATO, citing concerns about the presence of terrorists in both countries. During the negotiations, there were concerns that the Turkish concerns might be too difficult for Sweden to solve and that Finland would advance towards membership on its own without Sweden. Finnish politicians have, however, been very supporting of advancing towards membership together with Sweden. And I think this echoes Sweden's support for Finland during the Winter War, when the Swedes had a slogan, Finlands sak är vår, Finland's cause is ours. President Niinistö has also repeatedly commented and changed his slogan into Sweden's cause is ours during the application process. There's been quite a lot of developments about this just in the last couple of days, and the information coming from Prague, where some of the heads of states have been meeting, has been that Turkey would currently be willing to accept Finnish membership, but not Swedish. So I think we'll need to see how this situation is going to evolve in the near future, and with the government change in Sweden as well. During this whole process, despite taking Turkish concerns seriously, many observers felt that the Turkish opposition to the Finnish and Swedish applications was also directed towards unrelated issues within NATO and with the US, and possibly even Turkey's internal upcoming elections. At the NATO summit in Madrid, agreement was reached in terms of accepting Finland and Sweden as applicants. Ratification by Turkey is still unscheduled, and the situation is still very much fluid. The future is unknown, but mostly Finland and Sweden were very warmly welcomed. Since we are talking about Finland and Sweden joining a military defense alliance, it's worth highlighting what they would bring militarily. The information here is derived from the Global Firepower Index. It has Sweden on the left, Finland on the right. It states the defense budget ranked, projected GDP, population, and good to note that Sweden is twice the size of Finland in terms of population, so at 10 million versus 5.5 million. Active military personnel, reserves, Air Force size ranked, and Navy size ranked. I think the takeaway from this is that Sweden has a particularly strong Air Force and Navy. Sweden relies on their own JAS Gripen fighter jets, which they have about 100. The Swedish Navy is extremely modern and capable. Finland, on the other hand, excels in land power, having been prepared to defend its over 800-mile land border with Russia alone. Finland also has the largest artillery in Western Europe and a very large trained reserve. And I think this is important to note. If you look at the reserve numbers here, about 32,000 for Sweden and 900,000 for Finland. And this is an extremely sizable force in a Western European and global context. You are looking at 1/900,000 part of this reserve. I've spent 12 months in mandatory conscription in the Finnish army, and I am a second lieutenant in the reserve. Finland also has a fairly modern Air Force with American FA-18 fighter jets and new F-35s on order. US officials from the Departments of State and Defense concur with Finnish and Swedish that the countries be security providers, strengthening NATO's defense posture in the Baltic region in particular. Finland is expected to exceed NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target in 2022. And note that in addition to this defense spending, Finland has this sizable reserve in addition. Sweden has committed to meet the 2% goal as soon as possible. Some analysts have expressed concerns that Finland and Sweden's accession could provoke Russia and question NATO's ability to defend Finland's over 800-mile long border with Russia, which would double Russia's existing borders with Russia. Finnish officials, however, contend that Finland has long defended its own borders and would continue to do so in NATO. Something else that Finland and Sweden bring to the alliance are strong traditions of societal resilience and substantial experience dealing with Russian disinformation efforts, cyber attacks, and hybrid threats. My tagline here in orange says security providers, not consumers. And what does this mean? Well, not being a consumer of security, not provoking wars with other countries, not threatening other countries, having the resources to defend themselves. Security providers, on the other hand, could mean that having Finland and Sweden in the alliance makes defense of the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and even Norway easier. At this stage, the future remains unknown, but mostly Finland and Sweden have been warmly welcomed into NATO. In the US, the Senate voted 95-1, considered a slam dunk for national security, and 28 of the 30 NATO members have already ratified Finnish and Swedish membership. The remaining countries to do so are Hungary and Turkey. As a Finnish observer, the application process seems like a gauntlet with obstacles and challenges. It's also easy to forget that every decision taken by our politicians has had to be weighed with the backdrop of an ongoing war in Europe and the threat of the conflict escalating. Even though a state of peace prevails in Finland and Sweden, Ukraine has been under attack for over 6 months. The impacts of the war of aggression Russia is waging in Ukraine are quite grave and far-reaching. It's impossible to think about the return to the old and familiar ways that we had. As President Niinistö remarked in a recent speech, Finland will have Russia as a neighbor in one form or another, and they will continue to be there, even if there were no turn for the better. Ukraine has shown us what can be achieved when you combine an unwavering will to defend one's country with military capabilities. Ukraine has, however, also shown that it is lonely defending your own country alone, even with aid and assistance. I will end my speech with a quote by the Norwegian Prime Minister. NATO is a defense alliance. The Nordic region poses no threat to anyone. Swedish and Finnish membership will enhance the security framework and will benefit the alliance as a whole. Thank you very much. That concludes my speech.